April 1774. It's been over a decade since Britain's triumph in the 7 Years' War, and let me tell you, things have been anything but peaceful since. I'm James Carter, a landowner and militia officer from the quiet town of Stratford, Massachusetts, and I've watched the tension between the colonies and London grow thicker than the fog off the river in the early morning. The trouble? It's about who calls the shots here in North America. The British Parliament insists on taxing us, saying they have the right, but many of us colonists see it as nothing short of tyranny. What really grates is their new royal proclamation from 1763, which slaps a ban on moving west past the Appalachian Mountains. For guys like me, dreaming of new farmlands and fresh opportunities, that's like telling a kid they can't have the biggest slice of pie. Spoiler, we weren't happy. Back then, the first gunfire of the French and Indian War, what the Brits call the 7 Years' War, echoed not far from here in the Ohio country. A young officer named George Washington led those early shots, a name you might know. After the war, London hoped peace would settle the frontier, but the proclamation only stirred resentment. It cut off access to cheap, fertile lands and piled more fuel onto the fire of colonial resistance. Fast forward to the infamous Boston Tea Party. Yes, the one where a bunch of rowdy patriots tipped 46 tons of tea into the harbor like it was some sort of protest smoothie. London's response was swift and brutal. 4,000 Redcoats marched into Massachusetts, the port was blockaded, and our local governments stripped of power. General Gage took over as military governor, turning Boston into a fortress. The new laws, called the Coercive Acts, or as we called them, the Intolerable Acts, didn't just punish Massachusetts. They angered all the colonies. The Quebec Act, for instance, handed over vast tracts of land to Canada and tolerated Catholicism there, which many of our staunch Protestant neighbors in New England found downright offensive. It was like London was poking us with a stick while telling us to behave. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses openly supported Massachusetts and was promptly shut down by Lord Dunmore, our royal governor. But shutting us down only made us louder. I attended one of the meetings back home in Fairfax County, where George Washington himself chaired the discussion. The mood was fiery, no more polite requests. We declared that only our own assemblies had the right to govern us. The powers London claimed over us were the most grievous and intolerable species of tyranny. Calls for a colonial congress grew louder, and in October 1774, leaders from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. The room buzzed with tension and hope. John and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, both fierce and self-made men, spoke passionately about the British occupation. John Dickinson from Pennsylvania urged calm and reconciliation, while Patrick Henry from Virginia, fiery as ever, demanded total independence. Picture Henry in a crisp waistcoat, his earnest eyes blazing as he declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." And you get the idea of just how heated these debates were. Despite our differences, we agreed on a plan. Boycott British goods until the Intolerable Acts were repealed, and send one last petition to King George III. We asked for peace, liberty, and safety, pledging loyalty but demanding respect. Spoiler alert, the king ignored it completely. Winter approached and tensions escalated. General Gage, uneasy with the growing militias training around Boston, sent troops to seize gunpowder stored in Suffolk County. Rumors flew wild that the British were massacring villagers and shelling Boston, though none was true. Still, thousands of patriots poured into the streets of Cambridge, forcing loyalists to seek refuge in the city. That winter, British troops fortified Boston, but Parliament was slow to send reinforcements. Our resolve, however, only hardened. By early 1775, parts of Massachusetts were declared in open rebellion. Patrick Henry's words echoed through the colonies. The war was inevitable. And then, in April, the moment everyone feared came to pass. British troops set out under cover of darkness to Concord, aiming to seize our weapons and arrest leaders. But thanks to riders like Paul Revere, the warning spread fast. Militia gathered in Lexington to meet the Redcoats, and when the first shots rang out at dawn, no one knew who fired first. 8 of our men fell, and just 1 British soldier was hurt. It was chaos, the first blood spilled, our revolution ignited. As the British pushed on to Concord, they found little left to seize. The local militia, swelling in numbers and fury, forced the Redcoats into a disorganized retreat back to Boston, ambushed along the way. Homes were stormed, houses searched, and the smoke from burning supplies curled into the April sky. By nightfall, the British were back behind Boston's walls, exhausted and battered. We had lost fewer men, but gained something priceless: hope. The colonies rallied, surrounding Boston with thousands of militia, turning the city into a besieged fortress. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. No longer just a forum for protest, it became a wartime government. Men like Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and the young Thomas Jefferson stepped into the spotlight. But the pressing question remained: who would lead this ragtag army? There was only one answer for many of us: George Washington. Tall, commanding, and dressed in his Fairfax militia uniform, he was the symbol of our cause. When Congress unanimously appointed him commander-in-chief, he accepted without pay, only expenses, knowing full well the storm ahead. I'll never forget Washington's somber reflection: "Unhappy it is that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by a race of slaves." A grim choice, but one no virtuous man could ignore. And yet, before Washington could even reach the army, the British had already made their move. Something was coming, something that would change everything. Little did I know the real battle was just beginning. The early morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Boston as I pulled my coat tighter around me, the chill biting through the fabric like the tension in the air. It was April 18th, 1775, and the city was a powder keg, ready to blow. Word had spread fast. British troops were making a secret move, and we patriots were ready to meet them head-on. I'm James Carter, remember. A tall man with a sturdy frame, hands calloused from years working the land and drilling militia. That day I wore my best leather boots, scuffed but reliable, paired with dark breeches and a wool waistcoat that had seen better days. A tricorn hat sat jauntily atop my thick brown hair, and a leather satchel hung by my side, filled with powder and musket balls. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, heavier than any pack. The British force, led by Colonel Francis Smith, was supposed to slip quietly through the countryside to Concord, about 20 miles west of Boston, to seize our hidden stockpiles of weapons. But secrecy was no friend of ours. Our spies and riders, heroes like Paul Revere and William Dawes, were already racing ahead, their horses pounding the dirt roads as they warned townsfolk to arm themselves. The air was thick with anticipation. I could see it in the faces of my fellow townsfolk, determined men, some barely old enough to grow beards, others with graying temples that spoke of hard-lived years. They gathered in clusters, whispering plans, loading muskets, checking flints. Mothers peeked from behind curtains, their eyes wide but proud. At the village green in Lexington, Captain John Parker stood tall, his square jaw set in grim resolve. He wore a simple blue coat with brass buttons and a red sash tied around his waist, a small flourish that somehow made him seem both approachable and fierce. His boots were polished, almost mocking the dirt beneath them, but his hands trembled slightly as he addressed the 80 men assembled. "Stand your ground, but don't fire unless fired upon," he ordered. "Remember, we're not here to start a war." Yet, I looked around and caught the eye of a young militiaman, barely more than a boy, gripping his musket as if it were a lifeline. I gave him a nod and a quick smile, trying to inject some courage. "We'll make 'em think twice," I whispered. As the sun began to rise, the redcoats appeared on the horizon, columns of scarlet marching steadily, their bayonets gleaming like needles in the dawn light. Their polished boots clicked rhythmically, a stark contrast to our ragtag militia's uneven shuffle. Officers barked orders, their faces cold and unreadable beneath their cocked hats. The tension was electric. A stray dog barked once and the moment snapped. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but the sound shattered the fragile calm like a thunderclap. Chaos erupted, muskets flared, smoke swirled, and men fell. I remember crouching behind a low stone wall, heart pounding so loudly I feared it might give away my position. 8 of our men lay dead or dying on the green, while only a single British soldier was wounded. I felt a bitter taste rise in my throat. This was no skirmish anymore. This was war. After the firing ceased, the redcoats marched on toward Concord, their faces tight with unease. We gathered quickly, the word spreading that the British had lost the element of surprise. Our caches were moved or hidden just in time. I rode with a group of riders ahead of the main militia, scouting and relaying messages. The towns were alive with urgency, women loading powder horns, children watching wide-eyed, and old men sharpening blades. At the North Bridge in Concord, our numbers had swelled to over 400 Minutemen. The air was thick with smoke from burning supplies, and the acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nostrils. The British Guard was outnumbered 4-1. Colonel James Barrett, a burly man with a booming voice and a coat that strained at the seams, urged us forward. Neither side wanted to fire first, but nerves frayed quickly. The British volley was ragged, and we returned fire with steady aim. The first British soldier to fall was a shock that sent murmurs through their ranks. Then the redcoats turned and fled. Victory tasted strange, bitter and sweet all at once. We stood there, stunned by what we'd achieved, yet painfully aware that this was only the beginning. The British retreat back to Boston was a nightmare. Ambushes sprung at every turn. We picked off officers, and the regulars responded with brutal house-to-house searches. I remember ducking as musket fire cracked near my ear, the smell of smoke and fear thick around me. Homes were stormed, innocent families caught in the crossfire. By the time the British reached Lexington again, they were exhausted and battered. Reinforcements under Lord Percy, a stout man with a face as round as his belly and a booming laugh that seemed out of place in war, arrived with cannon fire that scattered our militia, temporarily. As night fell, the redcoats limped back into Boston, their numbers thinned and morale shaken. The cost was heavy, 73 British, dead and wounded, and nearly as many of us patriots, but the seed of rebellion had firmly taken root. That night, around the flickering firelight in my modest home, I sat with my wife, Elizabeth. She wore a simple but elegant dress of deep green wool, the fabric soft against her skin, and a delicate silver pendant hung at her neck. A gift from me before the tensions escalated. Her eyes, dark and warm, searched mine. "James," she said softly, "this is no longer just talk. The war has begun." I squeezed her hand, knowing she was right. The road ahead was uncharted, dangerous, and full of sacrifice. But before I could even catch my breath, a shadow crossed the doorway, a messenger, pale and breathless. "There's news from Philadelphia," he whispered. "The Congress is gathering again, and they're about to make a choice that will change everything." I looked toward the window where the first stars began to pierce the night sky and felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the storm we had unleashed. The real fight was only just beginning. The candlelight flickered against the rough wooden walls of my study as I unfolded the letter from Philadelphia. The the script hurried yet purposeful. The weight of those words settled over me like a thick fog rolling in from the Atlantic. The Continental Congress was convening again, this time not just to grumble about Parliament's latest insults, but to prepare for war. No more gentle petitions or polite protests. They were building an army. I'm James Carter, by the way, still trying to make sense of a world unraveling beneath my boots. That evening I sat back in my worn leather chair, the scent of burning pine from the hearth mingling with the faint aroma of Elizabeth's lavender perfume. She stood nearby, her slender fingers twisting the silver chain around her neck, her dark eyes reflecting a storm of worry and hope. An army, I murmured. We're no longer just farmers and shopkeepers. We're soldiers now. Elizabeth gave a half-smile, the kind that barely masked her fear. And who will lead us, James? We need a man strong enough to unite us all. That question hung in the air. Among the whispers and debates, one name echoed louder than the rest: George Washington. The tall Virginian had already made a name for himself in the French and Indian War, and now, clad in his Fairfax militia uniform, he was a symbol of unity the colonies desperately needed. A few days later, news arrived that Congress had unanimously chosen Washington as commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. At 43, he stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a stern, weathered face, marked by the years of frontier battles. His uniform was impeccable, dark blue trimmed with buff, polished boots shining even in the muddy streets. There was something regal about him, not a king, but a leader born from the soil and sweat of this land. I remember the day he arrived in Cambridge to take command. The chill in the air couldn't compare to the electricity buzzing through the gathered militia. Men in homespun coats and patched breeches lined the streets, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes fixed on the man who represented their fragile hope. Even the women gathered, their dresses simple but neat, some clutching handkerchiefs embroidered with blue and white, others wearing bonnets tipped just so, adding a hint of grace amidst the roughness. Washington's voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority as he addressed the crowd. We stand on the brink of a great trial, but I have faith in your courage and resolve. Together we shall defend our homes and our liberties. I felt a surge of pride and fear all at once. This was no longer a skirmish. This was a war for our very existence. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Militias from all over Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and beyond poured into the encampments around Boston. Tents sprouted like mushrooms in the fields, the air thick with the scent of wet wool, gunpowder, and sweat. I found myself drilling alongside men I'd known since childhood, their faces grim but determined. Elizabeth did her part, too. She organized supplies, tended to the wounded, and offered comfort where she could. Her dress, a deep burgundy with lace edging at the sleeves, was often smudged with dirt and flour dust from baking bread for the soldiers. The silver pendant she wore caught the sun sometimes, a small beacon amidst the hardship. But it wasn't just the battlefield that demanded our attention. Washington and the Congress faced enormous challenges, arming and feeding thousands of men, many of whom had never fired a musket, let alone marched in formation. Supplies were scarce, and the British blockade made getting more nearly impossible. I recall one biting cold evening, standing guard near the powder stores, the snow crunching beneath my boots. A fellow soldier, young Thomas, whispered, "Do you think we can really beat the Redcoats? They've fought in Europe, with trained armies." I shrugged, staring at the flickering lantern light. "We've got something they don't, home, and a cause worth dying for." The tension was palpable everywhere. Rumors of spies and traitors circulated, and the British were not idle. General Gage's troops fortified Boston, and skirmishes flared along the outskirts. The famous Battle of Bunker Hill was just around the corner, and though I wasn't there, The stories of valor and loss spread quickly. But even as the war loomed, life found moments of unexpected levity. One afternoon, at a makeshift mess hall, I spotted Washington sharing a rare laugh with his aides. He'd just tried to tame a stubborn horse that refused to budge. The general's powdered wig was askew, and his usually stern face cracked into a grin. "I swear that beast has a better will than Parliament," he joked. That moment of humanity was a balm to all of us, proof that beneath the uniform and the lofty speeches was a man who understood the burden we carried. Yet beneath all this, a shadow lingered. Whispers of divided loyalties, of spies embedded among our ranks, and of British plans more sinister than we imagined. One night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, a rider arrived breathless with news. A British officer had been seen meeting secretly with a known loyalist in Boston. The war was not just fought with muskets and cannon. It was a battle of trust and betrayal, and we stood on the edge of a knife. As I lay awake that night, staring at the stars beyond the canvas of my tent, I wondered who among us could truly be trusted, and what secrets were still hidden in the shadows. The fight for liberty had begun, but the true war might be far more complicated than any of us dared imagine. The dawn broke over the encampment like a whisper, pale light filtering through the fog that clung stubbornly to the fields around Boston. The air was sharp and cold, biting through my worn coat and stinging my face as I made my way toward the command tent. The weight of the past weeks pressed heavily on my shoulders. Our ragged army was growing, but so were the dangers, both seen and unseen. I'm James Carter, militia captain turned soldier, and every day felt like stepping deeper into a storm I couldn't yet see the end of. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was tense. Maps sprawled across rough wooden tables, dotted with pins and scrawled notes. George Washington stood over them, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light streaming through the flaps. His expression, ever stoic, betrayed a flicker of frustration. "Intelligence reports suggest loyalist activity is rising inside Boston," he said, voice low but steady. "We cannot win this war if treachery festers in our own backyard." Beside him, Major Henry Blake, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a quick temper, nodded grimly. "We've uncovered a network of spies feeding information to General Gage. Their reach extends beyond Boston, even into our camps." I felt a chill unrelated to the cold. A spy among us? Trust was the backbone of any army, and suddenly that foundation felt shaky. Later that day, as I made my rounds through the camp, I noticed a woman standing alone near the edge of the encampment. She was a striking figure, tall and slender, with fiery red hair pulled into a loose knot that revealed the curve of her neck. Her dress was simple but elegant, a deep sapphire blue that caught the sunlight, and a delicate silver locket hung around her throat. The kind of woman you'd notice in a room full of men in faded coats and muddy boots. Her name was Margaret Ellis, a widow from Salem who had come to tend to the wounded and offer aid where she could. Rumor had it she was as sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous, though no one could quite say how. Some whispered she had connections both here and within the city, moving between worlds like a ghost. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice low but clear as I approached. "There's talk of a planned British assault. They aim to strike at our supply lines tonight." I frowned. "How certain are you?" Her green eyes flashed with a mixture of fear and determination. "Enough to warrant preparation. We can't afford to be caught off guard." That evening, under the cloak of darkness, the camp buzzed with quiet urgency. Men hurried to reinforce defenses, double-check muskets, and tend to the powder stores. Elizabeth had helped organize the women in sewing tents, patching clothes and readying bandages. Her burgundy dress was replaced by a plain gray shift, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked beneath a simple cap. a far cry from the graceful woman I knew, but no less fierce. As the hours dragged on, I found myself standing watch near a thicket of trees, the cold seeping into my bones. The silence was broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the crackle of dry leaves beneath cautious footsteps. Suddenly, a shadow darted between the trees, a figure moving swiftly but carefully. I raised my musket, heart pounding. "Who goes there?" The figure froze, then stepped into the moonlight. It was Margaret. "I had to make sure the warning was taken seriously," she whispered. "There are spies even among our own men. Trust no one beyond your closest comrades." Before I could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the night. Then the first volley of musket fire erupted from the edge of the camp. Chaos exploded. Shouts pierced the darkness as British troops and Loyalist sympathizers launched a surprise attack, targeting supply wagons and tents. Sparks flew as lanterns shattered, and the acrid smell of burning canvas filled the air. I shouted orders, rallying the men to hold the line. Through the smoke and confusion, I caught sight of Margaret moving with purpose, directing the women to safety and tending to the wounded with swift hands. The fight was brutal but brief. Our militia, though outnumbered, knew the land and fought with desperate courage. By dawn, the attackers had retreated, leaving behind smoldering ruins and a camp shaken but unbroken. In the aftermath, as we counted losses and stoked the fires to chase away the morning chill, Washington approached me. His eyes, usually so unreadable, held a flicker of something almost like gratitude. "Today proved one thing," he said quietly. "This war is not just against the British soldiers, but against those who betray us from within. We must root out the traitors, or all we've fought for will be lost." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the battered camp, I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. The enemy was not just across the river or behind the lines, it was closer than we dared imagine. And somewhere, hidden among friends and foes alike, the true danger awaited. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a darker chapter. The question was, who would be the next to fall, and who would betray us all? The chill of early morning wrapped around me like a damp shroud as I stepped out onto the uneven ground of the militia encampment outside Boston. The sky was a dull gray canvas, and a fine drizzle slicked the worn paths between tents. I'm James Carter, and that day the weight of uncertainty pressed heavier than the musket slung over my shoulder. The attack the night before had left us rattled. Supply wagons smoldered in the damp earth, tents were torn and stained, and whispers of betrayal buzzed like gnats. Trust, once the sturdy backbone of our cause, now seemed fragile, easily shattered with a careless word or glance. Washington moved through the camp like a man carrying the burden of 1,000 storms. His broad shoulders were hunched against the rain, and his usual commanding presence was laced with a rare, somber gravity. Clad in his dark blue coat with buff facings, a powder horn slung across his chest, he met with his officers beneath a canvas awning, maps spread before them, soaked with rain and smeared with mud. "We must tighten our ranks," he declared, voice steady but edged with urgency. "Spies lurk in shadows, and the enemy is bold, but we will not falter." I nodded, feeling the cold bite of resolve settle in my gut. The enemy was not just the British Redcoats, but the invisible threats that crept within. Later that day, I made my way to the makeshift infirmary, where Elizabeth worked tirelessly. Her once elegant hands were now roughened and stained with soot and blood. But there was a fierce determination in her eyes that outshone any fear. She wore a simple linen shift, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the burgundy dress of finer days folded neatly away. A faded blue apron bore the marks of constant use, and her auburn hair was tucked beneath a plain bonnet, strands escaping to frame her flushed face. "James," she greeted me quietly, We're running low on bandages and clean cloth. The women have done what they can, but supplies are scarce. I squeezed her hand, the warmth a brief comfort against the cold reality. I'll see what I can find. As I turned to leave, a voice called out. Margaret Ellis, the fiery redhead who had warned us of the attack, approached with purpose. Her sapphire dress was replaced by a darker cloak, the silver locket glinting faintly in the dim light. There's talk of a secret meeting tonight, she said, voice low. Some loyalists plan to strike again, to cripple our efforts from within. I frowned. Where? Old Mill Road, near the river. It's risky, but we need eyes and ears. That night, cloaked in shadows and the soft murmur of restless soldiers, I joined a small group tasked with surveillance. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth slick and treacherous beneath our boots. The moon peeked through scattered clouds, casting ghostly light on the twisted branches overhead. We moved silently, hearts pounding with every crack of twig or distant call of a night bird. As we neared the mill, muffled voices drifted through the night air, angry, conspiratorial. Peering through the gloom, I recognized several men, some known loyalists, others faces I had seen among the militia, their loyalty now a bitter question mark. One, a tall man with a scarred cheek and a sneer, spoke harshly. The patriots grow stronger by the day. We must act before Washington and his ragtag army choke the city. Another, younger and nervous, nodded. The next attack will be swift and deadly. We have the plans, the men, and the weapons. Boston will fall back into King's hands. My blood ran cold. These weren't just whispers. They were a blueprint for disaster. We withdrew silently, heartbeats loud in the still night. Back in camp, the news spread quickly. Washington called an emergency meeting at dawn, his face pale but resolute. We face enemies without and within, he said, but we are patriots, bound by a cause greater than fear or betrayal. We will root out these traitors and stand united. The days that followed were a blur of interrogations, watchful eyes, and tightened security. Friendships were tested, and suspicion cast long shadows over every gathering. Elizabeth stayed by my side, her hands steady even as the world around us trembled. In quiet moments I caught glimpses of the woman behind the nurse, the fierce spirit who refused to yield. But beneath the surface, the war's true cost was beginning to show. Families torn apart, neighbors turned against each other, and the ever-present fear that the next betrayal could come from the closest of allies. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting blood-red hues over the camp, a courier arrived breathless, a letter from Philadelphia. The Congress was moving toward declaring independence. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The colonies were poised to break their chains or be crushed beneath them. As I folded the letter, a cold certainty settled. The path ahead was dark, perilous, and irrevocable. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows, a secret waited, one that could shatter everything we fought for. The revolution was no longer just a battle for land or rights. It was a battle for trust, for truth, and for the very soul of a nation yet unborn. The morning fog hung low over the camp, softening the outlines of tents and men alike, as if nature itself hesitated to witness what was unfolding. I'm James Carter, and that day the air felt thick, not just with mist, but with the weight of history pressing down on our shoulders. Word had spread quickly through the camp. The Continental Congress was edging closer to a decision that would forever change our lives. Independence. The very word tasted bitter and sweet on the tongue, like dark chocolate laced with ash. George Washington moved among us with quiet gravity, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the pale light. His uniform bore the grime of days spent in the field, but his eyes held a fire that no amount of hardship could dim, I caught a glimpse of him speaking with John Adams, a man as fiery as the Virginia hills, known for his sharp tongue and sharper mind. Adams's coat was a deep navy, buttons gleaming, his powdered wig slightly askew as he paced with restless energy. The camp was alive with murmurs and speculation. Soldiers adjusted their worn coats, cleaned their muskets, and exchanged hushed theories. Many of the men, rough and weathered from years of toil, wore patched trousers and faded shirts, but their eyes shone with a fierce hope. Elizabeth moved through the tents like a guardian angel, her slender figure wrapped in a simple gray shawl, the silver locket at her throat catching the light as she tended to the sick and wounded. Her hands, though gentle, were firm, a reminder that even in war, compassion must endure. That afternoon, I found myself beside the riverbank, watching the current swirl around moss-covered stones. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden streaks that danced on the water's surface. It was a rare moment of peace, and I breathed it in deeply, knowing it might be fleeting. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the water. Turning, I saw Margaret Ellis approaching, her red hair a fiery banner against the muted landscape. She wore a dark coat pulled tight against the chill, and her eyes held that familiar gleam of determination. "We received word," she said, voice low. "The British are planning a major offensive. They aim to break the siege before the Congress can act." I frowned. "How soon?" "Within days. They've been gathering troops and supplies in Boston. It won't be long." The weight of her words settled over me like a stone. The siege, the battles, the betrayals, it all led to this precipice. That evening, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The Declaration of Independence had been drafted, a bold statement of defiance and hope. Thomas Jefferson's words, fiery and eloquent, were set to be presented to Congress. The news spread like wildfire. Around campfires, men read aloud passages, words that spoke of liberty, equality, and the unalienable rights of man. Even the most hardened soldiers paused, the gravity of the moment piercing through the grime and fatigue. Washington summoned his officers for a late-night meeting. His voice was steady, but the lines etched into his face deepened with worry. "This declaration will change everything," he said. "It will unite us, but also make us traitors in the eyes of the Crown. We must be ready." I felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the enormity of the choice before us. To stand and fight for a new nation, or to kneel and accept a life shackled by distant rulers. In the days that followed, the camp buzzed with preparation. Drums rolled, orders barked, and muskets were cleaned until they gleamed. Elizabeth and the women worked tirelessly, sewing flags and mending uniforms. Her dress, now a sturdy homespun, bore the faint scent of pine and smoke. Amidst the bustle, a letter arrived from a trusted source within Boston. It spoke of increasing unrest, of soldiers weary and supplies dwindling. The British were not invincible, but neither were we yet ready for the storm to come. One night, as I stood watch beneath a sky thick with stars, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Margaret, clutching a folded parchment. "Something you need to see," she whispered. Unfolding the paper, I read a list of names, men accused of treason conspiring with the enemy. Some were prominent figures trusted by many. The betrayal cut deep. "Who can we trust now?" I asked, voice barely audible. She met my gaze, eyes fierce. "Only those willing to fight for the future, no matter the cost." The revolution was no longer a distant dream. It was here, in every whispered secret, every loaded musket, every beating heart. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew the true battle was about to begin. The dawn broke cold and gray over the fields outside Boston, the sky heavy with low-hanging clouds that promised rain. I pulled my cloak tighter around my shoulders, the damp chill seeping through the fabric as if the very air conspired to wear us down. I'm James Carter, and every morning in this war felt like waking beneath a gathering storm. The camp was restless. Word had spread that the British were preparing a large force, better armed, better trained, and hungry to crush our rebellion before it could breathe free. We knew the coming days could shape the fate of everything we held dear. George Washington moved among the men with a steady purpose, his tall frame commanding attention, even in the throng of soldiers. His uniform bore the marks of many long marches, mud stains on his boots, frayed cuffs, but his eyes held that same unwavering fire. He spoke quietly with his aides, planning, calculating, preparing. In the mess tent, I found Elizabeth and Margaret working side by side. Elizabeth's hands fluttered over a stack of bandages, her face pale but determined beneath the soft folds of her bonnet. Margaret, ever the striking figure, had shed her sapphire cloak for a plain gray dress, practical and unadorned. Her fiery hair was pulled back tightly, revealing a sharp profile etched with worry and resolve. "James," Elizabeth said softly as I approached, "we've had reports of deserters. Some men can't face what's coming. We've got to hold them together." I nodded grimly. "Fear is the enemy's ally. We'll need every man's courage." That afternoon, a courier arrived with a sealed letter bearing the unmistakable wax seal of the Continental Congress. Inside was news that the Declaration of Independence had been formally adopted. The colonies were no longer subjects. They were a new nation. The camp erupted in a mixture of cheers and solemn silence. For many it was the spark of hope, for others a step into the unknown abyss. As night fell, Washington called a council of war in his tent. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on faces drawn tight with fatigue and determination. "The British will not wait," he said. "They will strike soon, perhaps under cover of darkness. We must be ready to meet them, or risk losing everything." I felt the weight of his words settle deep in my chest. The men around me shifted uneasily, gripping muskets and powder horns as if they were lifelines. Later, as I stood guard near the riverbank, the rhythmic splash of oars caught my ear. A small boat glided silently through the dark water, carrying a figure cloaked in shadows. Margaret emerged, her eyes bright despite the gloom. "I've learned their plans," she whispered urgently. "They intend to attack the fortifications at Breed's Hill before dawn." Breed's Hill. That name sent a shiver through me. It was a strategic point overlooking Boston, a place where the fate of the siege could be decided. The night was a blur of activity. Men hurried to their positions, the clatter of muskets and the murmur of prayers mingling with the cold wind. Elizabeth moved among the wounded, her touch steady even as the first shots rang out. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Smoke curled into the sky as cannon fire tore through the air, mingling with the sharp crack of muskets. I found myself locked in a desperate struggle, the faces of comrades flashing before me, some brave, some terrified. Amidst the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Washington, standing resolute atop the hill, rallying his men. His voice carried over the din, a beacon of strength. Hours passed like minutes, and when the smoke finally cleared, the cost was staggering. We had held the ground, but at a terrible price. The fields were littered with fallen friends, and the moans of the wounded echoed through the night. As dawn broke, the realization settled. This was no longer a mere rebellion. It was war, bloody, merciless, and relentless. That evening, as I tended to a wounded comrade, Margaret approached with a grim expression. "There's more at stake than just this battle," she said quietly. "Secrets have been uncovered, plans that could change everything." She handed me a folded document, its edges worn and stained. I unfolded it carefully to reveal a map, marked with red ink and cryptic notes. "This," she whispered, "is a plan to flank our forces, to crush the rebellion before it truly begins." The room seemed to close in, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down like a stone. The revolution was no longer just a fight for independence. It was a desperate struggle against time, betrayal, and overwhelming odds. And as the shadows lengthened outside the tent, I knew the darkest hours were yet to come. The morning after the battle dawned cold and gray, the ground beneath my boots still stained with the blood and mud of yesterday's fight. I'm James Carter, and though the sun rose as it always did, nothing felt the same. The cost of holding Breed's Hill pressed on us like a weight too heavy to bear. Washington moved through the camp with quiet resolve, his uniform dirt-smudged and his face drawn, but his eyes burning with an unyielding fire. Around him the men murmured of losses and valor, of courage tested and fears faced. That day, as I walked through the rows of tents, I spotted Elizabeth near the infirmary. Her dress, once simple homespun, was now stained with soot and sweat, the sleeves rolled back to reveal arms hardened by hours of tending wounds. A faint smile flickered as our eyes met, a brief moment of warmth amid the cold reality. "James," she said softly, "the men need hope now more than ever." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep inside. Later, Margaret sought me out by the river's edge, her face pale but determined. The fiery red of her hair was muted beneath a dark hood, and her green eyes held that familiar spark. "There's news from Philadelphia," she whispered. "The Congress is preparing to send envoys to foreign powers. We need allies if we're to stand against Britain." I frowned. "France, perhaps?" She nodded. "Yes, but it's risky. They want assurances of our resolve." As the days passed, the camp bristled with activity. Drums echoed, orders shouted, and the scent of gunpowder and burning wood filled the air. The men trained relentlessly, their faces etched with a mix of fear and determination. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood watch near the outskirts when a figure emerged from the shadows. John Hancock, the wealthy merchant from Massachusetts. His fine coat and polished boots marked him as a man of means, but his eyes were fierce with purpose. "Captain Carter," he said, voice low, "the Congress needs men like you. We must rally the colonies, unite the people behind this cause." I met his gaze steadily. "We're ready to fight, but the road ahead is dark." Hancock smiled grimly. "Dark, yes, but filled with promise." That night, news arrived of a secret meeting in Boston. Loyalists planned to sabotage our efforts, to fracture the fragile unity we held. The betrayal stung deep. Washington called an emergency council. His voice was steady but heavy with the burden of command. "We face enemies within and without," he said. "Trust will be our greatest weapon and our greatest challenge." In the days that followed, I found myself caught between duty and doubt. Friends questioned loyalties, whispers of spies echoed in the tents, and the line between ally and enemy blurred. Elizabeth stood by me through it all, her strength a beacon in the gathering storm. Her dress, now faded and patched, bore the marks of sacrifice, but her spirit remained unbroken. One night, as rain hammered the camp, a messenger arrived with word that the British planned to cut off our supplies, to starve us into submission. The siege would tighten, and the coming winter promised hardship beyond anything we'd faced. I looked out into the darkness, the cold wind biting at my face, and felt a fierce resolve ignite within me. The revolution was no longer a distant hope. It was a burning reality, demanding all we had and more. And somewhere in the shadows, the true cost of freedom waited to be paid. The winter of 1775 settled over our camp like a heavy gray blanket, cold, relentless, and unforgiving. I'm James Carter, and as the frost crept into the bones of the earth, it seemed to seep into the very marrow of our resolve. The once bustling fields around Boston grew silent beneath layers of snow. Tents sagged under icy weight, and the men's breath hung in the air like ghostly whispers. Our uniforms, patched and threadbare, offered little defense against the biting chill. Yet, despite the cold, the fire in our hearts refused to dim. Washington moved among us, his tall figure swathed in a woolen greatcoat, the collar turned up against the wind. His face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes held that familiar steadfastness. Even in the darkest hours, he was the rock we clung to. Elizabeth's hands were red and cracked from endless hours tending the sick and wounded in the cramped, freezing infirmary. Her dress, now a thick woolen garment of muted brown, was often damp from snow and sweat, but she never wavered. I caught her once stitching a small flag, the stars and stripes glowing faintly by candlelight. Margaret Ellis had become a shadow in the camp, moving silently between tents, delivering messages and sniffing out whispers of betrayal. Her once fiery hair was tucked beneath a tight cap, her eyes sharper than ever. One bitter evening, as the wind howled like a banshee outside, a courier arrived with news that sent a ripple of hope through the frozen camp. France was considering an alliance. The prospect of foreign aid was a beacon in the gloom, but it came with strings and uncertainty. Washington called a gathering in the main tent, his voice low but resolute. "We fight not just for survival, but for the birth of a nation. Our sacrifices will not be in vain." The men cheered, their voices hoarse but determined, muffled beneath scarves and hats. Yet beneath the camaraderie, the strain was palpable. Desertions increased, supplies dwindled, and sickness spread like wildfire. The cold was an enemy as deadly as any musket ball. One night, as I walked the perimeter, I overheard a heated conversation between two soldiers. Words like betrayal and spy hung sharp in the frosty air. Trust was fraying, and paranoia gnawed at us all. Back in my tent, Elizabeth held my hand, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight and the pain of uncertainty. "James," she whispered, "how long can we hold on?" I swallowed hard, the weight of command settling heavier than ever. "As long as we must." Then came a storm unlike any we'd seen. Snow piled high, winds tore through the camp, and the cold threatened to freeze the very soul of our cause. Supplies were scarce, and rumors of British offensives grew louder. Amid the tempest, a messenger arrived with a letter from Washington. His words were both a call to courage and a warning. The coming months would test us beyond anything endured before. As I read, a sudden knock came at the tent flap. Margaret slipped inside, eyes burning with urgency. "James," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "there's been a betrayal. Someone close has been leaking our plans." The room seemed to close in. Fear, anger, and disbelief surged through me. The revolution was no longer just a battle against an empire. It was a battle for our very souls. And as the storm raged outside, I knew the coming days would demand sacrifices none of us were prepared to make. The fight for freedom was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The camp lay shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the wind's mournful wail weaving through the skeletal branches of the frost-laden trees. I'm James Carter, and as the bitter winter deepened, so did the shadows around us, both in the frost-bitten fields and within our own ranks. The betrayal, Margaret revealed, cut deeper than any musket ball. Whispers spread like wildfire, secret meetings, coded messages, and a traitor moving unseen among us. Trust, once a given, became a precious and fragile currency. Washington summoned his closest officers for a council beneath the dim glow of lantern light. His face, lined with exhaustion but steeled by resolve, bore the weight of a nation's hope. "We must root out this treachery," he said, voice firm, for if we falter now, all is lost. As the days crawled by, suspicion gnawed at the camp. Friends eyed each other warily, letters were scrutinized, and every shadow seemed to hide a lurking enemy. Elizabeth, ever my anchor, moved through the turmoil with grace, her simple gray dress dusted with snow and soot, the silver locket at her throat a quiet talisman of hope. One evening a letter arrived from an unexpected source, a coded message intercepted from the British. It revealed plans for a massive assault aimed at breaking our lines and crushing the rebellion once and for all. Margaret, her red hair now streaked with gray, pressed the letter into my hands. "This is our last warning," she said, eyes fierce despite the weariness. The night before the attack, the camp was a restless hive. Fires flickered in the darkness, faces etched with fear and determination. Washington walked among us, offering quiet words of encouragement. His blue coat was worn, buttons dulled, but his presence was a beacon. As dawn broke, the horizon ignited with the flash of cannon fire and the thunder of marching boots. The British surged forward, their red coats a stark contrast against the snow-covered earth. We met them with every ounce of grit, muscle, and will. Muskets roared, bayonets clashed, and the ground trembled beneath the fury of battle. Amid the chaos, I caught sight of Washington, rallying his men with a voice that cut through the smoke and fear. Hours later, as the smoke cleared, the cost was etched in the frozen ground. Fallen comrades, shattered muskets, and a fragile hope that still flickered. The revolution was no longer a distant dream or a whispered promise. It was a hard-fought reality, born in blood and fire. As I stood among the wounded and the weary, Elizabeth by my side, Margaret watching from the shadows, I knew one thing for certain. This war for liberty was far from over, and somewhere beyond the horizon, new battles and darker secrets awaited. The fight for America's soul had only just begun.